Welcome. Thank you for coming out this morning. I hope everyone got some rest after all the sirens subsided last night, and that you were safe and sound. Each year in March, which is Women's History Month, the museum is honored to present the Mary Strauss Women in the Arts Endowed lecture. This annual event has been made possible due to the vision, commitment, and generosity of Mary Strauss, who is with us this morning. Please join me in thanking her for her support of the museum, its programming, and women in the arts. I was a bit worried that Furio was not going to make it last night, so I'm thrilled that he's here with us today. Dr. Rinaldi is curator in charge of the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts, the Department of Prints, Drawings, Photographs, and Artist Books of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, the largest collection of works on paper in the Western United States. An expert in 15th and 16th century Renaissance drawings, particularly the schools of Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo, he has published extensively on the subject in the Burlington Magazine, Master Drawings, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art Journal. At the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, he organized the exhibitions Color into Line, Pastel from the Renaissance to the Present, and the critically acclaimed Botticelli drawings, the catalog of which has been named among the best art books of the year by the New York Times. Upon acquiring the first work by Tamara de Lempicka to enter a U.S. museum, he organized the first U.S. retrospective on the artist, which opened late last year to absolutely rave reviews. The New York Times declared, by turns swaggering, sapphic, and sensational, the 100 paintings and drawings deliver every inch of Lempicka's luxuriant rigor, and they show us where the life pumps through it all. The exhibition traveled to Houston, to the Houston Museum of Fine Arts in March, and is up until May 26th. So this still gives us a chance to head down to Texas to see it. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Furio Rinaldi to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here, and happy Women's History Month, in fact. Yes. I am really delighted to be invited to this lecture today. It's a pleasure to come back to St. Louis. It's a museum that I absolutely love. We have many great colleagues here, Claire Cobaza in the Department of Drawings and Prints, Judy Mann, Simon Kelly, of course. We partnered with the museum for as you remember, the Degas and the Millinery Trade exhibition, which was one of the best shows I've ever seen on Degas. And I'm a really big fan of the curatorial force that you have here at the museum. The collections are world-class, extraordinary, but you're very, very lucky to have an array of amazing curators. And thank you, Jenny, for the wonderful introduction. So, I'm very happy to present today the work of Lempicka. As Jenny said, we presented the first retrospective of her work in San Francisco in October. The show in San Francisco ended in February at the Young Museum, and now it's on view at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston through the end of May. As this lecture is, and I have, of course, some beautiful installation shots of the presentation in San Francisco, where you can see her monumental paintings, life-scale portraits, how they're really commanding the galleries. So as this lecture series is focused on celebrating the work and legacy of women artists, and I applaud Mrs. Strauss for this incredible commitment and ensuring that the scholarship on women artists continues and is constantly on the forefront. I wanted to start today's talk with an extremely interesting contribution on our knowledge of Tamara de Lempicka, written by another woman artist, Françoise Gilot, whom you may know. She passed a couple of years ago, in fact. So in September 1980, just a few months after Tamara de Lempicka died in her house in Cuernavaca in Mexico, François Gilot paid a heartfelt homage to the artist in a poignant obituary published in the French edition of Vogue, which you see here. That's the spread that was published in 1980. By then, it is important to recall that Tamara was nearly forgotten, considered mostly a phenomenon pertaining the Art Deco period, but something really not relevant to art history, certainly marginalized by the art historical canon as a phenomenon of fashion and decoration more than painting. But Lempicka's strong character and singular artistic persona come to life in François Gilot's vivid essay, which was aptly titled Tamara de Lempicka, Mystérieuse et Connue, Mysterious and Known. So I want to read a few excerpts from this beautiful obituary. I met Tamara de Lempicka for the first time at the home of a painter friend. The presence of this tall, svelte woman immediately called attention to itself with the insolence of a crash of cymbals. How theatrical her carriage, how supple the waves of her strawberry blonde hair, what authority in her finely pitched voice. Her beauty was striking. Everything about her, from the glint in her eyes to her lively gestures, breathed a rare energy. Her left hand, for example, traveled through space without any sign of drag from the weight of a gigantic ring whose size and setting fascinated me. She used to phone me often, alternatively using her artist name, Tamara de Lempicka, or her title as Baroness Kufner, which confused me a little as to her identity. Sometimes she would show up at my place unannounced and then would instantly leave again, chased by some inner hurricane. She wanted me at all costs to see her paintings and come to her studio. Something inside me resisted, refusing the unfolding of this invasive friendship. So much Slavic dynamism paralyzed me. The more Tamara insisted, the harder it was for me to make up my mind to follow her to her house. Gilot eventually did follow Tamara to her apartment, and in the passage that follows here, she provides a very acute assessment of her paintings. I quote, "Despite the satin-like porcelain appearance, despite the glossy look, a passion is simmering beneath, revealed by the fullness of the volumes, the violence of the reds, blues, and greens, bursting in a rather well-tempered spectrum. Nothing saccharine here. Moderation is allied with immoderation, the oniric with the rational, murky impulses with pure ones, in a successful synthesis of classicism and modernity. What is important in Tamara de Lempicka is that her style is indeed the vehicle best fitted to her universe, the world in which she is and which she wishes to express. It is remarkable how she's able to characterize with the same ease a fallen aristocrat, her beloved daughter, or a moment of sensual or voluptuous abandon. Her draftsmanship caresses, embraces, and sometimes sets afire. Her portraits from the Art Deco epoch far surpasses the anecdotal interest of such denomination. They are penetrating and they strike their target, the psychological truth, sometimes indirectly in subtle fashion. In her work, as in all of painting of value, there is great taste, sometimes there is bad taste, but there is never just little good taste. End of quote. So this beautiful profile written by Gilot etched really the profile of Tamara, the woman, the artist, and her the trademark of her style. and I think encapsulates very well several themes that I have developed in my curatorial, approach as we were organizing the exhibition. And some of these themes are going to be the focus of today's talk, particularly the contrast between modernism and classicism in her art, and the multiplicity of her personas, Tamara de Lempicka, Baroness de Kufner, and others, as we will see. So it is not a surprise, in fact, that with such a big personality, the life of Tamara attracted in the last decades, I would say from the 1980s onward, an incredible amount of attention, particularly from pop culture. Barbra Streisand, Madonna are collectors of Lempicka and or have been inspired and captivated by her style. Lempicka's glamorous and transgressive lifestyle has been dramatized, sensationalized in musical plays, documentaries, and novels. Her artworks have been merchandised, appearing in posters, music videos, and commercials. So as the exhibition in San Francisco and in Houston offered viewers the privilege of enjoying Lempicka's actual paintings and drawings, not posters, not just images, my goal was to foreground the presentation of Lempicka's art, her contribution, her design process, and what makes her output as an artist very relevant within today's art historical canon. And specifically, I attempted to clarify some of the trajectories of Lempicka's style, her cultural horizon, and her artistic references, with a particular focus on her knowledge and appreciation of the European old masters, which have been my key of interpreting Lempicka's work. As Jenny said, my background as a scholar is European old masters and Renaissance and Mannerist art, so that was really my key of interpretation towards Tamara's world. So who was this young woman of about 25 from St. Petersburg, who around 1919 set herself the task of conquering the Parisian art scene? Her date and place of birth are the first mysteries surrounding Tamara Rosa Hurwitz, her newly revealed name. The name has been newly revealed with our exhibition. The alter ego behind the Baroness de Kufner, or the Monsieur Lempicki, whose name appears in several of the Parisian salons from 1922 to 1924, and who claim to have been born variously in Warsaw and St. Petersburg. As for the year of birth, the documents from Ellis Island, when she arrived in 1929 on her first visit to the United States, say that she was 29 years old, hence born in 1900. Her death certificate, written in 1980, says 81 years old. And in a profile published by the Houston Magazine in 1978, Tamara carefully erased, she penciled her age that was printed, writing instead 71, making her born in 1907. So Tamara was born in 1894. While more evidence on Tamara's background has emerged lately from the exhibition, we wanted to retain also in the show and in the catalog a little bit of the mystery, of the mystique that makes her work and her journey so special. So this is why we used different names, the different names that she adopted throughout her life, as I devised to structure the exhibition and the catalog section, so these 4 chapters. Far from being an eccentric habit, as it would seem from Gilot's essay, Lempicka's practice of changing names can be seen as a way for the artist to survive, as she constantly reinvented herself when confronted by the seemingly unsurmountable challenges that a woman artist and a Polish-Russian émigré of Jewish descent faced during the interwar years. Born Tamara Rosa Hurwitz, she signed paintings Lempicki at her first Parisian salons in the early 20s, and later, during her shimmering Art Deco siren days, began signing as Tamara de Lempicka. Then, seeking social standing and acceptance in New York and Beverly Hills, she adopted her aristocratic title Baroness Kufner after she married her second husband, Baron Raoul Kufner, in 1934. Thanks to the archival research carried out by some great Polish archivists, Katarzyna Miekowska and Andrzej Złowicki, we now know that Tamara was not born, as I said, in 1989 or 1907 or 1905, but in fact, June 6 of 1894. Her parents were Benno Hurwitz and Malwina Dekler, both of Polish Jewish origins, and who converted to the Reformed Church, so to Christianity, right before she was born, in order to leave Warsaw and travel more freely within the anti-Semitic constraints of the Russian Empire. So Poland at that time, when Tamara was born, was not a nation anymore. It was divided between Russia, Prussia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in order to travel within the different areas and region and to move to Russia, one needed a passport that was issued only if you were not Jewish. Her childhood was a privileged one. She's coming from a really upper class, and she spent her childhood between Moscow and St. Petersburg, and summer-long travels in the south of France and Italy with her beloved grandmother. Those trips provided young Tamara with the first exposure to the glories of European art and the old masters, which, as we will see, left a very deep impression on her visual vocabulary. St. Petersburg's own Hermitage Museum was, and still is, of course, the shrine of one of the world's most spectacular collections of European old masters. And the masterpieces that she saw attracted her eyes, I think, as much as the monumental decorative vases that adorn the large Renaissance rooms in the Hermitage Palace. So these vases were commissioned by Peter the Great and are entirely carved, as you can see, in malachite. It's a semi-precious stone mined from the local earth, which is characterized by a very distinctive and intense blue-green hue, which I think inspired what would become Tamara's signature color later on. It is also in St. Petersburg that Tamara would meet Tadeusz Lempicki, or Łępicki, as according to the Polish pronunciation, whom she married in 1916, and with whom she fled to Paris in 1918 upon the outbreak of the Russian Bolshevik Revolution. Tadeusz, who was from an aristocratic background himself, did not have any connections in Paris, nor did he want to work, in fact. So it was up to Tamara to resume her artistic training and provide for her young family. Encouraged by her sister, Tamara enrolled in a couple of art academies in the vibrant community of Montparnasse, spaces where women could practice drawing and painting, often free of charge. Lempicka's earliest recorded drawings show the influence of the latest evolution of the European avant-gardes, Russian constructivism, Italian futurism, and French cubism, as they were all shifting away from the radical abstraction of the earlier decades, moving towards figuration and a more classical appreciation of the human form. One of her earliest drawings that we see here, this abstract composition, shows her alignment particularly with the pursuits of Fernand Léger. For artists like Léger, who had fought in the trenches during the war, the adventure of pure abstraction became less meaningful after the war. And as he returned to Paris, he resolved to never let go of objects again, he said. His painting epitomizes the trajectory and spirit of new post-war painting that would be followed by Tamara de Lempicka. painted upon her arrival in Paris on a very humble cardboard. Street at Night, that you see here, is an early depiction of a Parisian street that captures the urban gloom enveloping the city following the end of World War I in 1918. Between the strikes and food rationing, the city struggled for a few years to retain its prosperity. And when the economy bounced back, the decade that followed, known as the Années Folles, the crazy years, was characterized by a blooming of the arts, which reestablished Paris as the world's capital of music, art, ballet, and literature. Tamara would be at the center of this artistic resurgence, and in this portrayal of Paris, she clearly still draws from the fragmentations of forms and the dynamic play of electric lights, typical of the Cubo and Futurist aesthetic of the period. The practice of drawing marked the earliest stages of Lempicka's career, offering her a fast and satisfying opportunity to make a living for her and her family. As early as 1921, in fact, she published some elegant fashion illustrations, some figurines de mode, for Femina and l'Illustration de Mode, which were very popular fashion magazines at the time. As her work was being published, Lempicka cut the illustrations and pasted it on an album, which you see here, and it's still preserved in the family collection, thus allowing us to recognize Tamara's earliest work, which was unsigned. So it would be really impossible to know that she published these figurines if the family didn't keep this very important album. The illustrative and highly stylized character of her early drawings, like the umbrella that you see here, or Woman at the Mirror, reflects the influence of contemporary fashion illustrators like Georges Barbier, Eduardo Garcia Benito, whom she kind of copied or was inspired by in his Vogue cover here, Helen Dryden, Georges Le Pape, all designers that created many covers for Vogue or Vanity Fair, which Lempicka copied or re-elaborated as she was refining her own graphic vocabulary. It was, however, only under the guidance of André Lhote, a post-cubist French painter, that Lempicka would eventually acquire a more methodical approach to art making. From about 1921, she attended Lhote classes at the Académie Notre-Dame des Champs and the Académie Montparnasse, where André Lhote tempered the interpretation of Cubism, an emphasis on life drawing, proved to be highly influential to her developing style. It must be recalled, even more so for the nature of this lecture and this program, that Tamara de Lempicka belonged to an early generation of women art students in France who were allowed into such classes and admitted to public art institution and education, where they could freely study the male and female nude from live models. Such practice was largely prohibited to women in France until the turn of the century. And I illustrate here a painting from our own collection in San Francisco, showing the atelier of the French academic painter Bouguereau in Paris, of course, where there's not a woman in sight other than, of course, the nude female model that you see at the center. All the other artists are men. The daily exercise on life drawing was the linchpin to the artistic practice of André Lhote at the Académie in Montparnasse. And his nude that you see here from our own collection in San Francisco truly expresses all the hallmarks of his figurative style and technique as a draftsman. Using silvery graphite, he reduces the figures into simplified forms that emphasize their geometrical qualities. Through shading, Lhote infused his forms with a sculptural feel that enhanced the classical quality of his figures, a skill that Tamara de Lempicka applied promptly to her figure drawings, so imitating her teacher, and quickly surpassing him, as you can see from her drawings and also her paintings. As one can see from Lempicka's early work, the sculptural appearance, the three-dimensional appearance of her figures is a trademark of Tamara de Lempicka's aesthetic. She achieved great sculptural and three-dimensional effects in her drawings and paintings through extensive use of a polished chiaroscuro shading and attentive observation of sculptures from the ancient world, the Renaissance, and the Baroque period. Through her travels in Italy and daily visits to the Louvre, she actively copied examples from sculptors like Gian Bologna, Desiderio da Settignano, that you see here, and Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Lempicka provided on panel a very sensual rendition of Bernini's famous masterpiece of the Santa Teresa of Avila, one of the masterpieces of Baroque Roman sculpture. She brought the Bernini's icy Carrara marble almost to life by infusing the flesh tones and this kind of very sensual attitude of her saint. André Lhote's contribution to Lempicka artistic development was not merely technical, but was also intellectual. Ever since she traveled as a young girl to Venice, Florence, and Rome with her grandmother, Lempicka had been exposed to great examples of Italian art. However, it was only through André Lhote that she was able to organically assimilate her admiration for the past into a modern design process. That curious mix of extreme modernism and classical purity that would become indicative of her style. An incredibly successful portrait artist, both on canvas and on paper, André Lhote also provided Tamara de Lempicka with the fundamentals of portraiture, the genre that would become central in Lempicka's career. As for nudes, the practice of portraiture was also deeply rooted in Lempicka's knowledge and appreciation of the old masters, particularly Italian mannerists, Parmigianino, Pontormo, Bronzino, Salviati, virtually ignored by André Lhote, but greatly admired by Lempicka for their emphasis on sophistication and style. And I couldn't resist of including your spectacular Salviati painting here at the museum, where you can see kind of the emphasis on the ornamental elegance of the figure, the slanted pose, the use of fashion to express the figure's power and stature are all elements that Tamara took for her paintings, of course, modernized. The assertiveness, of the pose, of course. In the group of paintings captured in a photo of Lempicka's studio at Place Wagram in 1921, we can see that portraiture and the human figure in general had become already by then the core of Tamara de Lempicka's artistic pursuit and production. At the time, of course, she didn't have a proper clientele. So her sitters were the most immediately available members of her family, as for many women artists, if we think of Mary Cassatt and Morisot, starting with her young daughter, Quisette, Marie-Christine, called Quisette, portrayed seated next to her teddy bear, her friend Ira Perrot, as well as some anonymous friends and artists that posed for her, as in the painting known as La Bohémienne at lower right, which is in the exhibition. Even more meaningful to our understanding of Lempicka's artistic trajectory and references is the bookshelf featured in this photograph, as well as the books it contains. Among the books owned by Lempicka at this early date, Alain Blondel, who's a Lempicka scholar, has brilliantly identified a copy of aphorisms and thoughts on art written by the French 19th century painter Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, titled Pensées, Thoughts. This book was published in 1922 in the wake of the large and very successful retrospective of Ingres drawings and paintings mounted at the Hôtel de la Chambre Syndicale, which Lempicka attended. The opportunity of that exhibition allowed to an unprecedented exposure to the work of the great French neoclassical artist, whose aesthetic ideals and technical prowess were suited to her own artistic sensibility. Lempicka particularly admired from Ingres the deftness and purity of line, and took from him the sensitive application of silvery graphite in her drawings, as well as the icy detachment of Ingres' sitters, the sensuality, the detached sensuality of his nudes, the balance between modesty and exuberance, and the reduced chromatic range of his paintings. At this time, the theme of the nude, so in the early 20s, the nude, specifically, of course, white and female, was finding new and widespread popularity among the artists belonging to the retour à l'ordre, return to order, the conservative artistic movement, which sought a return to figuration after the radical abstraction brought by the avant-gardes. And the retrospective of Ingres of 1921 helped cement the neoclassical artist as the example to be revered and revived by the modern artists. Lempicka was the most consistent and notably the first woman artist to reference and attempt to modernize the traditional genre of the female nude, which canonically is considered the male painter's domain and its enjoyment for the gratification of the so-called male gaze, of course. Between 1923 and 1929, Lempicka executed numerous paintings of female nudes, which, while aesthetically very innovative, they also grant Lempicka a special place today in art history for their unabashed portrayal of female sensuality. Furthermore, by tackling this genre, one of the pinnacles of the academic and artistic tradition, Tamara de Lempicka aimed to ensure for herself the coveted professional and critical acknowledgement within the codes of the academic art. The tondo that you see at left, the very famous Turkish bath by Ingres, 1862, with its erotic display of female nudes, represented, of course, a turning point in the genre of nude ensembles, which Lempicka quite precisely took as an inspiration for her squared work called Rhythm, Le Rythme, 1924, her largest painting. The work was presented in 1925 at her solo show in Milan, and then at the Salon des Indépendants the following year, where it was praised by critics. In Rhythm, Lempicka embraced the tension between tradition and transgression, particularly in its representation of female nudes, as the group of 5 women are shown in a moment of intimacy and enjoyment, seemingly removed from any gaze. It is because of their unique and contradictory, sometimes, combination of cool classicism, explicit eroticism, and sapphic audacity that paintings such as this one led critics of the time to call Lempicka's work perverse Ingresism, a comment that cemented Lempicka among the most important and leading exponents of the return to order movement in Europe. Ingres inspired Lempicka not only for large nudes ensemble as Rhythm, but also for smaller canvases and more intimate depictions of female nudes produced to cater to the sophisticated and more liberal Parisian clientele that she was developing. La Belle Raphaela is one of Tamara de Lempicka's most remarkable compositions in this respect. Painted in 1927, this intimate portrayal of a nude woman absorbed in her own erotic pleasure is a tribute to the titular Raphaela, one of Tamara de Lempicka's favorite models, one of her lovers, and also the subject of a group of canvases that we have reunited in the exhibition. A very rich texture of art historical references characterize this memorable image, while its cool voluptuousness draws again directly from Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres and his beautiful exotic odalisque. The dramatic play of light and the chiaroscuro and the reduced palette limited to gray, black, and red of Raphaela's lips and the shawl, I think, is almost an homage to Italian Baroque artists as Caravaggio. Lastly, I argued that the distinctively sensual pose, captured from below, from a very low angle, is also traceable in Gustave Courbet's Bacchante, which was exhibited in Paris in that same year. Though, in a departure from both Ingres and Courbet, Lempicka's nude does not portray an idealized or mythological figure, but a contemporary woman. Yes, and of course, I could not include the amazing Artemisia Gentileschi from St. Louis, where you can see they are, posing in a very similar way. Both, of course, derive from the ancient sculpture of the Ariadne in the Vatican. So that is really the classical prototype for both. The same process of modernization of classical references can be appreciated with Nu adossé, leaning nude, presented at the Salon d'Automne by Lempicka in 1925, the same year of the seminal Art Deco exhibition, of course. In spite of the references to the chaste sensuality of Ingres, in 1925, when Lempicka first presented this painting, it was still very rare for a female artist to paint such daring and explicit female nudes. So ahead of the Salon submission, Lempicka chose to sign the painting T. de Lempicki, using the masculine declension of her husband's name, thus creating some confusion. In fact, when Lempicka first exhibited at the Parisian Salon, 22 to 25, she chose to sign the majority of her work under the male declension Lempicki. This gender ambiguity was a deliberate choice by the artist, who extended it not only to the signatures of her paintings, but also to the catalogs of those exhibitions, where she was credited in the artist biographies that are usually at the bottom of those catalogs. She was credited as né, French masculine form for born, instead of né, feminine form, in Warsaw. While French salons had always been open to both genders, one must recall that the juries, the critics, the art dealers, the buyers who could ensure an artist's success were predominantly all male. So in kind of a trick that reminded me of Victor Victoria, almost, the 1982 American movie in which we have this struggling soprano played by Julie Andrews, who reinvents herself as a gay Polish count, as a nightclub performer. We have the same. We have Lempicka, who blurred her identity, registering with critics with varying and surprising results. In his review of the 1923 Salon des Indépendants, Arsène Alexandre, a renowned critic, admired the work of Monsieur Lempicki, praised for the clarity with which he rendered the cool expressions of his sitters. The following year, 1924, Salon des Indépendants, Monsieur Lempicki's identity remained a mystery. Édouard Saradin, another critic, believed the artist to be male and Russian, as the Salon catalog stated that he was born in St. Petersburg, so adding this to the confusion. Lempicka not only cleverly manipulated her identity to break into the competitive Parisian art scene and attract a more alternative clientele, but also in her portraits of the 20s, she introduced a gender-bending pictorial imagery reflective of the contemporary habits of the upper classes during the Année Folle. In these towering portraits, women, as you can see here, are characterized by confidence, unprecedented vigor, and assertive coolness. The men, by contrast, are accorded a sexual charge and captured with languid attitudes, affected poses, rarely seen in the genre of male portraiture. At the time, her sitters included members of the Parisian intelligentsia like André Gide, the Milanese jet set, as well as white Russians who fled, from Russia like her and were living in Paris. She portrayed all of these figures as clear-cut, angular figures using extreme and very flattering proportional distortions. A selection of her nudes and society portraits was presented in a solo exhibition in 1925 in Milan. And that exhibition marked the beginning of her public career and also the kind of revelation of who she was beyond the salons. Her gallery of modern aristocracy codified her distinctive and enormously successful format of portraiture, rooted in French neoclassicism, smoothly executed, and impossibly stylish. Lempicka never concealed the extent to which the interchangeability of her signatures at these dates also corresponded to her sexual identity. Openly bisexual, the artist, since 1922, entertained a relationship with French poet Ira Perrot, who is the focus of a section in the exhibition. Perrot was the model of a portrait of a young woman in a blue dress. Tamara first publicly exhibited painting at the Salon d'Automne in 1922. And the painting is dominated by Ira's penetrating gaze and the blue of her dress. But the composition today is cropped at bust length, as you can see. And it was originally much larger, much wider. The painting's original format is known to us through an early photo showing a young Ira Perrot in front of the recently finished canvas. This photo, set in Lempicka's studio apartment at Place Wagram, was possibly taken, I argue, by Lempicka herself. As Perrot sensually reclines in front of the painting, suggestively gazing directly at the camera, one might gather the great intimacy occurred between the model and the person behind the lenses. Indeed, Perrot was Lempicka's lover, as no friend or family appears as often in Tamara's work. The two met in Paris as they were neighbors. They were living almost on the same floor at Place Wagram, and at the time they were both married to men. She's distinguished by a small face, dark green eyes, mahogany hair, and a pointed nose. Perrot is the subject of at least 8 of the artist's paintings, as well as several drawings, including this wonderful portrait drawing of Ira that recently reemerged from a private collection. It is drawn with colored chalks, and it shows Ira piercing gaze, looking at the viewer, and it was likely executed in preparation of the life-size portrait of Ira that you see at right, known as Her Sadness, Sa Tristesse, from 1923, and still signed Lempicka, in fact. This painting was published in a 1924 issue of the magazine Harlequin. It was a literary magazine, along with 2 texts, 2 poems, L'Idole and Eux, both written by Ira Perrot. And the text by Perrot may help explain the painting's meaning and the title. As the Idole, the idol, is almost a desperate description of an inaccessible goddess and may directly refer to Lempicka with its line, I quote, "The icier she was, the more they adore her." And also it follows by a description of the writer herself, dressed in black and kind of, restless, turning right and left without knowing why, nor where or how. And I think the painting is, in fact, almost a visual translation of Ira's poem. Perrot would lend her face to Lempicka again for the powerful 1931 portrait, where she appears as a vision in white, enfolded in calla lilies, a nearly nuptial painting, I believe, in which her dress of white satin sticks to her like a second skin. This is a room shot of the exhibition in San Francisco with all the Ira Perrot paintings that we had gathered for the show. But this specific painting, which is considered one of Lempicka's pinnacle in female portraiture from the 30s, is also one of the most famous one because it appeared in the 1990s at auction, auctioned off from the personal collection of Barbra Streisand. And you can see here the interior of Mrs. Streisand Malibu Art Deco house, where the painting is, towards the corner. And Streisand had a very, very important role in the rediscovery of Lempicka. She started collecting Lempicka from the 1970s. She understood her very, very well and formed this spectacular collection that then she sold in the mid-90s. And we were immensely grateful to Mrs. Streisand because also she agreed to write an original essay for our exhibition catalog where she explains exactly what she sees in Lempicka, what drawn her to this artist, and also how much she paid for the paintings when she bought it, how much she sold it for. So it's highly entertaining, but also sparkling and poignant. Ira Perrot modeled also for this small panel called Saint Moritz, painted in 1929 to grace the cover of the first German fashion magazine Die Dame. In 1928, the Swiss resort town of St. Moritz hosted the Winter Olympics. And at the time, it was a record number for female athletes. It was a record number for female athletes at an Olympic, summer or winter. There were like 15 out of 350 men, but still it was more than before. And in fact, as women making their way into the world of competitive sports, the German magazine Die Dame celebrated the event by featuring Lempicka paintings in its winter cover. St. Moritz have become by then a meeting place for European high society as well as Hollywood. And as I believe one can see a reference to Hollywood studio photography as Lempicka kind of borrowed from them the kind of upward gaze, the very dramatic tilted pose of the head that recalled, the Garbo movies or that Hollywood golden age of the 30s and 20s. And of course, Die Dame is the same magazine that hosted the very famous cover with Tamara in the Green Bugatti, which I learned from Jenny that will be here in the exhibition Roaring that opens in a couple of weeks. So it's a very, very rare impression. So you're all very lucky to have it here on display. Fashion plays a very, very important part in Lempicka's career and in her aesthetic. It is not an addition, it is not a decorative element, it is almost a structural force in her paintings. Lempicka, in fact, aptly captured a new type of woman, and fashion and the plurality of styles that she portrayed in her work reflect the societal changes that women embraced in the interwar period, when women began enjoying greater societal and economic access, of course, independence, agency, and empowerment. And like the convention-defying women who wore them, these garments represented a radical departure from preceding periods, with the modest and physically constrictive designs of earlier decades giving way to sinuous and draped silhouettes that emphasize women's shapes while also allowing greater liberty of movement. And the photogravure that you see at right from our collection in San Francisco, that is just 7-10 years before Lempicka's painting. So you can see the massive seismic change in fashion that occurred in not even a decade for women. Risen to an icon, one should say, of this modern woman and of Art Deco as a whole, Young Woman in Green was instantly acquired by the French state soon after its execution in 1932 for the nascent Museum of Living Artists. And it's still part, of course, of the National Collection of Pompidou. Lempicka's emphasis on the figure's assertive pose as she shades her eyes with the edge of a wide brim hat and her use of fashion to express the sitter power and social status are elements that the artist reprised again from 16th century Italian mannerist portraiture of Salviati, Bronzino, Parmigianino, whom she admired for their sophistication and style. But the figure is also reduced to mechanical forms. It's a celebration almost of the age of the machine. And I think that also speaks to your exhibition, Jenny, very well. Her skin is as smooth and metallic as that of a car. And she reflects, and you cannot see it probably here, but when you see the painting on display, her skin reflects the green of the dress as it's made of metal or mirror. So it's really fascinating. And word that is often abused nowadays, describing Lempicka, but also many other things, which is iconic. Well, I believe that this one is, and Lempicka's work is so iconic because she grew up looking at Russian icons. So small panel paintings, impeccably painted, with this enameled finish and with these very powerful images. So I think she was very much educated by that kind of format of painting style, and somewhat that what transpires in her modern rendition. And then, of course, yes, it's a pop icon as well. Amazing, right? Lempicka did not just portray this new woman, this modern woman, she embodied it. She embodied this very concept. In 1930, she moved into an extra-modern, chrome-pleated studio apartment at 7 Rue Méchain, designed by modernist architect Robert Mallet Stevens, and impeccably decorated with Art Deco furniture designed by her sister, architect Adriana Gorska de Monteau. And I think Adriana Gorska is another figure that is really worth investigating more and deserves a rediscovery. The apartment was meant to be a showpiece, of course, for Lempicka, where she could entertain. Her American cocktails are legendary, and also promoting her work as she rotated her paintings inside the apartment, periodically. Making an incredibly savvy use of the new media of newsreel, Lempicka was filmed also in 1932 for this 1.5-minute black and white documentary titled Un bel atelier moderne, a beautiful modern atelier, showcasing the artist in action. So we see here kind of the gloomy, almost 19th century male artist atelier, so very composed and kind of boring, and boom, we entered in Lempicka's studio apartment that she energetically, almost frantically draws her nude model. It is a rare recording that allows us to witness Lempicka at the height of her shimmering Art Deco persona, seamlessly shifting, as you can see, from studio time to cocktail hour. She's getting ready here. Amazing, right? And most importantly, also, it allows us to see the artist in action as she was drawing, which was very important for my research. So she's ready for dinner for one, right? She doesn't need anyone else. And I think she's been just served, perfect. And a cigarette first. And some of the paintings that she had in the apartment, so many of which we brought to the exhibition, of course. The turgid forms of Italian mannerism fueled the inspiration behind some of celebrated nudes of the period, like Spring, that you see here. This is a small panel, again, from 1930, formerly in the collection of Pierre Boucard, Lempicka's most loyal patron in that decade. The painting's ornamental elegance does also rely on a Renaissance inspiration, as the main couple stems from the cluster of heads appearing at lower left in Parmigianino's Madonna of the Long Neck, a masterpiece of 16th century devotional painting in the Uffizi, which Lempicka copied in a small sketchbook drawing, which was also in the exhibition, and then, use it as the kind of the template to paint the beautiful couple. Spring, like High Summer, The Straw Hat, St. Moritz, and Brilliance, is a part of a suite of relatively small panels featuring tightly cropped women, often adorned with flowers or other attributes reminiscent of the seasons. Most of these works were originally conceived to grace the covers of the German fashion magazine Die Dame, The Lady. The month of the magazine justified the seasonal element for the painting. For example, High Summer, that you see at left, was on the cover of the August 1928 issue, while St. Moritz, as we said, was chosen for the December 1929. Sourcing inspiration for such imagery, I argued that Lempicka may have turned her attention again towards the past, and particularly towards the work of Rosalba Carriera, the 18th century Venetian pastel artist who gained critical as well as commercial success in Europe by producing captivating portraits of the social elites, as well as exquisite pastels of heads and busts of young women disguised as allegories of the four seasons or the four elements or the continents. For her work at Die Dame, Lempicka seemed to have closely followed the format Carriera adopted in her pastels of attractive young women, cropping the figures in bust length, nude or semi-nude, and playfully adorning them with a variety of attributes of flora and fauna. On at least one occasion, Lempicka sourced Carriera directly. For one of her paintings, Femme à la Colombe, Woman with a Dove, that you see at left, which clearly reprised Rosalba Carriera's allegory of chastity in the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Dijon in France. Of course, providing a modernized and sexier version of the 18th century source. So this direct quotation provides some evidence to link Carriera and Lempicka, although centuries apart, but two of the most gifted and renowned portrait artists of their respective generations, whose lives and artistic trajectories appear remarkably similar, in fact, as they both operated between Italy and France, and they both focused their artistic productions to portraiture and allegorical images featuring young women. By 1929, Tamara has cemented her cool, high-gloss pictorial style, and the result of her artistic pursuits were exhibited the following year at the Galerie Colette Weil, 71 Rue La Boétie, her first solo exhibition in Paris. At nearly 36 years old, presenting her most recent works, including many works that we presented in the exhibition, Lempicka finally received the praise she always craved. 1929 marks also the year of Tamara's first journey to the United States, as in April, she arrived in New York on the Paris ocean liner. You see her here on the deck. She arrives in New York as she was commissioned to paint a portrait of Joan Price Jeffrey. She's the niece of Thomas B. Jeffrey, the producer of the first Rambler automobiles. Tamara took Joan to Hattie Carnegie, a leading fashion designer in New York, and chose clothes for the sitters. She kind of styled her for the painting. A bright red coat dress that allow a glimpse of a black skirt and translucent silk stockings. The narrow canvas barely contains Joan, strong-willed and androgynous, with her short hair, standing in front of a sleek background of New York skyscrapers. Two preliminary drawings, which we have gathered in the exhibition, attest to Lempicka's accuracy in the preparation of this masterful portrait, and also indicate that she was planning for a portrait of her husband, of Joan's husband, Rufus Bush, which was never completed because the couple divorced the same year. Very, very dynamic New York society. Tamara's own marriage, unfortunately, was also deteriorating as she painted this magnificent portrait of her husband Thaddeus, one of her finest. Here it is. The skyscrapers in the background suggest that this one was also completed after her first visit to New York in 1929. This elegant image of masculinity is distinguished by Lempicka's colossal frame, rendered in gray and black tones, illuminated only by the white scarf. The painting also reveals, upon a closer look, a small but significant detail. The left hand of the sitter, where the wedding band, the wedding ring should be, was intentionally left unfinished. Thaddeus, in fact, grew quite intolerant of his wife's affairs, the use of cocaine, the late nights spent at clubs, and the long work sessions listening to Wagner at full volume. She was a lot. Yeah. So, entering Baroness Kufner. In 1934, the artist married Raoul Kufner de Diozeg, a baron of Austro-Hungarian and Jewish descent, and one of her patrons and collectors from the 1920s. In 1939, upon the impending threat of the Nazi invasion, the Kufners left Europe for the United States, thus becoming an immigrant once again. Taking up residence in Los Angeles, Beverly Hills, and New York, Lempicka plotted her artistic comeback by reintroducing herself with her new title, Baroness Kufner. Once the painter of modern, jet-set, and cosmopolitan life, in the United States, Lempicka presented herself as the herald of the grand European pictorial tradition, producing religious paintings and humble still lifes inspired by the Flemish old masters. In the lead up and during World War II, her shift in subject matter from glamorous portraits to religious scenes and war scenes perhaps bespeaks an underlying fear for herself and her family, given their Jewish heritage. Quoted by the San Francisco Examiner in 1941, she declared, I quote, "With death and destruction rampant, how can I concentrate on painting, on portraits? In religious subjects, I find eternal peace, eternal calm, the peace and calm that world must seek after this Holocaust has passed. I am confining my works to landscapes, still lifes, and figure studies at present." In 1941, Lempicka presented her latest works in a touring exhibition in New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, organized by the New York-based art dealer Julian Levi. The exhibition featured the artist's neo-Baroque religious works and her still lives, overall 12 pictures, 12 paintings, and some drawings. And out of that selection, that exhibition, in the show, we have reunited 8 out of 12, including this beautiful still life. While Lempicka's flawless pictorial technique and draftsmanship received praise by the critics at the time, the sentimental pauperism and overly religious nature of her subjects was deemed inauthentic, insincere, and passé by the press, who nicknamed her the Baroness with a brush. The mild critical reception the artist received was counterbalanced, though, by the social excitement with which she was welcomed in America. I quote, "A slim, vivid woman with a shoulder-length mass of blonde curls has taken the town by storm," titled the San Francisco Chronicle upon her arrival in 1941. Once you've seen her, you'll never forget her. Again, her incredibly savvy use of the press during her American years is also something that is worth highlighting. It put Tamara ahead of her times in a kind of pre-pop art, era and use of the media in that respect. The Baroness was constantly in the press, quoted in interviews of all sorts of topics, from fashion to lifestyle, manners, hairstyle, food, flirting. I quote, "Flirting is like a sketch. It's light. Never say yes and never say no." I don't know what she meant. Lempicka, nonetheless, managed to balance the sparkling public persona with very meaningful charity work, especially during and after the end of the Second War. Fundraising for the Polish Relief, for the British Red Cross, for the War Relief. And while it is true that she continued painting and drawing, it is clear that the mixed reception of her later work led her to a progressive withdrawal from artistic life. After two small and inconsequential exhibitions in the 1950s and 60s, she stopped exhibiting her work altogether. She did continue painting, though, and in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, she experimented different venues and styles. She went through kind of a surrealist phase in the late 40s, abstraction in the 1950s, and then she started experimenting with this kind of palette knife paintings in the 60s. But again, she never really publicly exhibited. So for the exhibition, I kind of made a selection that kind of stopped at the end of the 40s. So kind of following her public career. And I thought it was a little bit, I don't know, unfair to show what was meant to be private. After the end of, and however, sorry, I just want to go back that the New York Times review that you've mentioned, well, of course it was acclaimed and was very nice about the show. They kind of wished to see more of these later things. So maybe, food for thoughts. We can mount another exhibition on her later things in the future. At the end of the Second World War, Lempicka often returned to her apartment, Rue Méchan, which she retained almost till the end of her life. And in 1949, she posed for the fashion photographer Willie Maywald for a series of photographs published for Harper Bazaar. These photographs are pretty eerie. She's draped in a dress by Italian fashion designer Schiaparelli. Lempicka seemed almost a ghostly figure moving among the ruins of a glorious past in a room decorated in the 1920s, inhabited by plaster casts. However, she was always confident of her talent, always confident that she would come back one day. And as Art Deco would be progressively rediscovered in the 1970s and her work reevaluated slowly but constantly, in 1978, the Houston magazine interviewed Lempicka in a lengthy profile and asked her how it feels to be rediscovered. I quote, "How does it feel to be rediscovered as someone who has disappeared, who is unknown?" Lempicka quickly replied, "Unknown? Unknown to whom? To these nobodies only. I have never been unknown. I have always been painting. They have not always been looking." And I was told that we have time for a couple of questions. If you have some, if you don't, no problem. And please go see. Yes, the lady in teal. Yes.
We'll bring you a mic. 1 second. Sorry, raise your hand.
Can you raise your hand again? I think if any of her works was confiscated by the Nazi. The answer is yes. There are several very important paintings that are still lost and whereabouts unknown that were confiscated, especially from the house of Pierre Boucard, who was one of our greatest collectors in Paris in the 1920s and 30s. His house was raided and several, especially female nudes, sapphic nudes, have disappeared from that. Someone else? Yes. Hello.
Hi, thanks for being here. What was her relationship to the group of women in Paris, the expatriates?
That's a great question. So you have to think that, especially following the Russian Revolution, Paris becomes almost a catalyst for a huge community of Russian emigre or coming from the Eastern Europe. The First War was particularly violent for the heart of Europe, for Central Europe. So in Paris alone, we have documented in 1920 a community of Russians of about 250,000 Russians living in Paris at the time. So huge. This also explains the kind of the electric success of the Russian ballet, of all this kind of revival for Russian folk artists, Goncharova. So Lempicka was connected to all of these artists and women artists. However, unlike Marie Laurencin of Natalia Goncharova or Sonia Delaunay, she never branched out into fashion, theater design, costume design, or interior decoration. Tamara wanted to be recognized and known only as a painter. She only exhibited at the painting salon. So she was very clear of what her artistic trajectory was. Then later in the 1930s, there was this group of women artists formed that was called Femmes Artistes Modernes, FAM, very important, that promoted the work of modern women artists. And Tamara exhibited with them through the entire run of that experience from 1932 to 1938. Then in 1939, as I said, she flees from Paris and arrives in the United States. So thank you very much. Okay, one more. Yes.
Yeah, we saw the show at the De Young, and it was just
thank
spectacular.
you. Thanks for coming.
And I was just captivated and drawn to the hands in her female portraits.
You were captivated by?
The hands.
The hands, yes.
They're just spectacular, and I just wonder if you showed the one, I think the Italian, early Italian drawing that had really nice hands too. I just wonder if you could comment on how she painted hands.
It's something that has been observed by many, how elegantly and expressive her hands are, within also a simplification, of course, because they're very schematic, they're very mechanical. In fact, if you look close, for those who've seen the exhibition or have the pleasure of seeing her work in person, the nails are also amazing. She does this French manicure, which at the time was all the rage. I think it's something, again, that comes from it's kind of a trope from Italian Mannerist portraiture. You have the beautiful Salviati painting here and the Giorgio Vasari painting that you have in the gallery. I invite you to look at the hands in Italian Renaissance and Mannerist art. It's all very expressive, languid. There's always a meaning that, kind of defines the line of the entire body, so to speak. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. And thank you for organizing this beautiful series of lectures.